Hello boys and girls, this is Jason Moore with MTGOacademy.com, and we're going to be doing some matchup videos here featuring this Elves deck, and we're going to be going up against New Plan playing a mono blue Delver deck, and this will be a very exciting matchup. I'm looking forward to it. Now, I've had some opportunity to test this deck just a little bit, but it is rather complicated to pilot, and there's a lot of decisions to make. There's a lot of actions that you can utilize with these creatures, so hopefully I'll be able to pilot this in a respectable manner. But I'm looking forward to these matches. I wanted to do a deck tech of this deck to refresh your memory. I did write an entire article on this specific list, which this was the list that initially began showing up in 4-0s in higher numbers, and from here, after the matches are over, maybe we can talk about some things that could be changed about the deck. But for now, we're going to run with this stock internet version. Now, the land base here is only 13 lands. We're playing 12 forests and a single island, which we can tutor up with a card called Sylvan Ranger. Now, this is a very low land count, and because there are so many one-drop creatures and so many mana producers, we can pull this off. Now, these creatures all serve pretty key roles, and they can do very interesting things, starting with perhaps the most interesting creature in the entire deck, and that's Quirion Ranger. Now, this is a card you probably recognize from the Stompy deck, but in this deck in particular, it actually has a lot more usefulness. It has a lot more applications, and that ability is very strong, especially with a deck that's playing so few lands. When we are stuck on one land, this allows us to tap that forest for mana, return it to our hand with the ability, and replay it and tap it again. So it nets us one mana there. It's also going to net us mana by untapping our mana producers, so our Llanowar Elves, our Finehorn Elves, any of them with Birchlore Rangers, Priest of Titania. So it's going to net us usually about 2 mana at least. Well, that's the average, I would say, 1 to 2 mana, if not more, which is already great. Now, it can also untap creatures like the Timberwatch Elf, the Well-Wishers, to get them to use their abilities again, or it can simply give a guy a sort of vigilance where we can attack with it and then untap it on the next turn to block. So this is one of the all-stars of the deck, and I'm kind of surprised to say that, but it really is true. 4 copies of Nettle Sentinel, which is not just an aggressively costed 1-drop at 2 power and 2 toughness for a single mana, but it also is able to untap constantly. So when this is paired with Birchlore Rangers, we can utilize this as a mana producer, which makes it a very unique card in the deck in that it serves multiple roles fairly well, I would say. Another card that we find in Stompy. 4 copies of Llanowar Elves and 4 copies of Finehorn Elves. These are essentially the same card here. One is a functional reprint of the other. I believe Llanowar Elves came first because it was in the original sets, if I'm not mistaken. And they simply just ramp us up. They get us potentially to 3 mana. And actually, this deck can do more than 3 mana on turn 2, which is pretty impressive. But, you know, they get us up on mana, and very good when paired with the Quirion Ranger as well. But they're mostly in here as mana accelerants, not really going to be that threatening on the attack. Birchlore Rangers, this fixes our colors here. I've actually never cast it for the morph, and I don't think there's any reason to, now that I think about it. Now, someone will probably be able to correct me there, but I don't. And maybe if we want a 2/2, and I should probably consider that option a couple times in some of these matches. But otherwise, this is a way to fix our colors, also ramp us. Like I said, it already works very well with Nettle Sentinel and some of the creatures that don't make mana, like Sylvan Ranger. It turns them into half of a Llanowar Elf, I guess we could say, which is pretty good in this deck, and I like having these guys around. 4 copies of Rancor. You also see this in Stompy, Hexproof, and Infect. One of the key green spells in this format. The best aura in the format, I would say. It's definitely a top contender there. And this is going to allow us to attack with some of these creatures into bigger creatures, but also force through damage because of the trample. And we can put this on a guy early, and once that guy gets killed, we obviously get this back. So it's got pretty much all upside here. Priest of Titania, one of the more explosive cards. We can play this on turn 2, perhaps with another elf after we've played a turn 1 elf, and then on turn 3 we can dump our hand and she can make a lot of mana that way. I actually haven't drawn into her in my test matches so far, so this will be the first time we actually get to play with her as far as I can remember. 4 copies there. As a 3-of, we have Sylvan Ranger, and this is mostly to ensure we hit our land drops, but actually it's mostly here to ensure that we hit that blue mana so we can cast Distant Melody. So there's 3 copies here. We don't really need multiples. You just want to get that bullet, that land bullet that is our single island here. So that's really what she's for. She doesn't have much use outside of that, other than adding to the elf count, which is of course very synergistic. Now 3 drops, one of the most deadly creatures in our deck is Timberwatch Elf. This is one of the finishers here. We're normally going to have a lot of elves on the battlefield, barring any mass removal. So this turns an unblocked creature into a house, a really big beater. It puts him on a very fast clock, maybe 3 or 4 hits, maybe 2 hits, And using the Quirion Ranger to double this up is pretty nasty, as is Rancor when paired with this ability. Llanowar Sentinel, this is in the 3-drop slot. It's really a 5-drop, if not a 7-drop, where you're going to get multiple 2/3 bodies on the battlefield. For, the first body is for 3, so it's reasonable but not impressive. And then the next ones are subsequently for 2, and so that is fairly impressive. Being able to spread across multiple bodies, and 2/3 is extremely relevant, as I think we'll be able to see in these matches. I'm going to make an early prediction here. I think this will be one of our better creatures matched up against the Delver creatures. And fortunately we have 2 copies of Spider Silk Armor in the main, and this is going to buff up our creatures a little bit, make them a little more resilient to removal, and also make our deck a little more resistant to flyers. And I think this art is really awesome. Excuse me. I really like this art here. Excuse me. Now let's move on to the 4 drops. We've got 3 copies of Distant Melody, and this is going to draw us a million cards. This is the Sphinx's Revelation of our deck. This is another card I haven't really drawn into. I think maybe it should be a 4-of, just on general principle, because this card does get really disgusting. This last guy, another 3-of in the deck, Kavu Primarch, and I think this is more of an 8-drop than a 4-drop, because casting it as a hill giant is just something I don't really want to do pretty much ever, unless I'm really desperate. Casting it as a 7/7 for 8 with the Convoke ability, so we don't have to have all that mana around, we can just tap our guys. Depends on the matchup. Sometimes it can be really good, sometimes it's just not that exciting at all. I think it's really good against decks like Goblins, where they don't really have enough, the type of removal that'll deal with this, so they have to pile on the damage. But against a deck like Delver, they can counter it because it costs so much mana. It's really hard for us to use this as bait. It's just going to time walk us if we get countered, and same if it gets bounced, which is almost even worse. So this is going to be our main card that gets sided out, I think, unless it just proves to be completely dominant in the game 1s. So that's the main deck against Delver. We do have the 2 Spider Silk Armor, which might help us out, but a lot of our creatures are going to be smaller than theirs. So my sideboard plan, at least going into these matches, is going to be to add and to retain as much muscle as we can. So any of the creatures that are larger, or the Timberwatch Elf that can make our guys larger, that's all going to stay in. Let's look at our sideboard, and I'll just talk about it generally as opposed to specifically to Delver, because that is in the written portion of the article, of course. So we've got 3 copies of Gleeful Sabotage. This has a lot of applications across the field, namely Affinity, which has become quite popular in the metagame. Also, against a deck like Delver that's playing Serrated Arrows and Spire Golem, it hits Post as well, also playing Serrated Arrows, but you can also target their Prophetic Prisms, any type of Signet they might be playing. Those are the 3 main decks, but Hex hexproof as well because we can hit enchantments here. This is a 2-for-1 card that's pretty nice to have around. We also have the additional copies of Spider Silk Armor. Now this is for a number of matchups, at least in theory. I would have to assume here, I'd have to presume, because it does boost the toughness of our creatures. So we want to use this against various damage dealing or -X forms of mass removal. But we also want to use this against decks with flying creatures. So it kind of serves a dual role, and that's what I like about the card personally. I'm glad it's in here. 4 copies of Thermokarst has applications against the Cloudpost synergistic decks, as well as the Temporal Fissure mana ramp decks that require either Karoo lands or enchanted lands, and this can become active as early as turn 2 in this deck, which is pretty strong. 2 copies of Viridian Longbow. We can use this against small creatures, perhaps the mirror match, if that ever became a factor. So far, I've used this against goblins to pretty powerful effect, as you can imagine, and we will be testing it against Delver here today. Lastly, we have 4 copies of Well-Wisher, which is a ridiculous life gain engine with so many elves on the battlefield at a given time, even against decks like Stompy that play a number of elves on their own. This thing, if it untaps, becomes very unwieldy, and you can get really high totals of life. If we can somehow squeeze this in against Delver, I wouldn't even mind playing it against them, believe it or not, because this is such an unwieldy and swingy card, and I don't think they have many ways to deal with it outside of serrated arrows. They can snap it and then try and counter it, but that is, that is more of a corner case than it is the majority. So this is the Elves deck. It's a mix of a beatdown deck with combo, a lot of mana engines and mana accelerants, and then crazy amounts of card advantage through Distant Melody. Card advantage all across the board here through Rancor, Llanowar Sentinel, mostly. Quirion Ranger presents some card advantage, and then out of the board we have the Longbow and the Sabotage. So a deck with a lot of play to it. It's kind of fallen off over the past couple weeks. Maybe it will see a resurgence, but we want to at least delve into this deck, no pun intended, a little deeper here. So we're going to take it against Delver. I hope you guys enjoy the matches. I know I will. And again, I'll try and pilot this to the best of my ability, so don't get too upset if you see some glaring play errors. But barring all that, let's get into these matches and let's battle.